What's up everyone and welcome to Game 2 of the 2021 World Chess Championship match between World Champion Magnus Carlsen and Challenger Nepomniachtchi. This was Magnus' first white game of the match, so it was going to be very exciting to see what he had prepared. So Magnus started things off with the move 1d4, which Nepo responded to with knight f6, c4 and e6, known as the Nimzo defense. If white plays knight c3, black's idea is to go bishop to b4. Now, Nepo usually plays g6, knight c3, d5, known as the Grunfeld defense, but it was not that shocking to see him deviating because Magnus had a lot of time to prepare for the Grunfeld. Also, the Grunfeld is a very sharp opening. There's a lot of lines black has to remember, and if you forget something, black can easily end up in a lot of trouble. Anyway, so Nepo played e6, Magnus played knight f3, Jan played d5, and Magnus played g3, known as the Catalan. Now the idea behind the Catalan is that if black ends up taking on c4 at some point, the bishop on g2 will be very strong on this long diagonal. So Nepo goes bishop e7, this is one of the main lines, bishop g2, castles, castles, Jan takes on c4, Magnus goes queen c2. Once again, these are all the main lines. Now here the main move from black is a6. And the point behind a6 is to meet queen takes c4 with b5, hitting the queen, and if the queen goes back, then bishop to b7, neutralizing this bishop on the long diagonal. And next up, black wants to go knight bd7 and c5. So black's usually doing well here, so what white often does after a6 is white often goes a4 to stop b5. You can't go b5 now, because then if black recaptures, your rook on a8 is hanging. So very often here, black will continue with bishop d7, and after takes bishop c6, neutralizing this bishop on the long diagonal anyway. But this usually transitions into a very slow game, and Magnus is usually pretty good in these positions. So it's not that shocking to see Nepo going for something a bit more dynamic. Instead of that, Nepo plays the move b5. And you might be thinking, right, like why isn't this move better than a6? I mean, it defends the pawn on c4, right? But what white often does here is white goes a4. Now here black cannot go a6, because once again, you'll lose your rook on a8. And you might be thinking, right, like, hey, but I can play c6, right? My rook is not hanging on the a file. But what white does here is white takes on b5, and after takes, note that now this diagonal is opened up, right? There's nothing that can block it except this knight. So what white does is white goes knight to g5, hitting the rook on a8. There's no way to block, like all these squares are covered, right? You'll just lose your piece. And you can also now play knight d5 to block, because now, guess what? Your knight is no longer defending this pawn, and checkmate. So that is why after a4, usually what black does is they go b4. Now this pawn is no longer protected, and white often picks off this pawn on c4, either with the queen or with one of the knights, like either knight fd2 or knight bd2, and picks off the knight that way. But Magnus had other ideas. He played knight e5, hitting the rook on a8. Nepo goes c6 to block. Now you can get your pawn back right now by taking on c6, but here black gets a lot of activity. The pawn on c4 is more of an asset, so to speak, and you can easily trade off these bishops potentially with bishop e7. Black's doing pretty well here because he has a pretty active game. So what Magnus does is he goes a4, hitting the pawn on b5, which is actually difficult to protect. You might think like, hey, I have a6, but after takes, you cannot take this way, because then you lose your rook to the bishop, and if you take with the pawn, then your rook is hanging. So instead of all that, Nepo goes knight to d5 to block this bishop on g2. Magnus continues developing with knight c3, putting pressure on the queen side and in the center. And Nepo says GTFO with your knight, he goes f6. So Magnus goes knight f3, he goes back, and Nepo goes queen d7, defending the pawn on b5. So Magnus goes e4, getting space in the center and kicking the knight. Now black doesn't really want to take here, because now white has a pretty strong center, and he also still has pressure on the queen side. This knight here is black's only really strong piece. So Nepo goes knight b4, and after queen e2, he goes knight to d3. Once again, this knight is black's strongest piece. But here, Carlsen goes e5. Once again, opening up the bishop on this long diagonal and creating tension on the king side. So Nepo goes bishop e7 to defend c6 and to neutralize his bishop a little bit. Magnus trades on f6, Jan recaptures, and Magnus goes knight to e4, activating the knight. Then the knight can jump to c5 in some cases, or like maybe trade off the bishop on f6. And Nepo goes knight to a6, developing his last piece into the game. Now here Magnus came up with quite a surprising decision. I was doing commentary today with Hikaru, and we expected something like bishop to e3. And now he keeps all of his options open. Like, does he want to take an f6, maybe play knight e5 later, or b3 to chip away on black's pawns on the queen side? But instead of all that, Magnus played knight to e5. Now you want to keep your strongest piece on the board, so Jan took the knight with his bishop. Magnus recaptured, and Jan played knight a to c5. And here Magnus is in a tough spot, right? Like, do you trade off this knight, or do you go knight to d6? Like, knight d6 looks very nice, but it does allow knight to b3, which hits the rook and the bishop on c1. So he could have traded here, but this position is not that pleasant. You never really want to take on b5, because now black gets to trade off the bishops, and black is just almost winning here, because I mean he has a huge majority on the queen side. His knight will be extremely strong either on d3 or b3, and white can really achieve anything with this dark squared bishop, because all of black's pawns are on light squares. So instead of all that, Magnus goes knight to d6. But this allows Nepo to go knight to b3, hitting the rook and hitting the bishop. Now here we were expecting bishop to e3. Nepo can take the rook in the corner, but after takes, white still definitely has a lot of initiative. First of all, pawn takes b5 is threatened. Like, let's say you make a useless move, like let's say you go king here, white can take. You cannot recapture because now your bishop is hanging. So black would have to address that first, right? Let's say black plays a move like a6 to defend that pawn. But here white can play someone like f4, defending the pawn on e5, and followed up with bishop e4, queen h5, and launch some sort of attack on the king side. So this was what we were expecting, but instead of all that, Magnus played rook to b1. But this is surprising, because now Nepo wins the exchange, and like Magnus doesn't have the bishop pair. Like, he has the bishop here, which is pretty active. He has this knight on d6, which is also very active. But an exchange and a pawn is a lot of material, so it felt like it should not be enough for Magnus. Now rook aba was played by Nepo. The idea is that if Magnus takes, now he can just recapture. Magnus can get the exchange back here, but this position is pretty rough, because black once again has this huge majority on the queen side. He will likely want to trade queens on the next move, and honestly this position is probably just lost at the top level. Right, it's very likely that one of these pawns will just promote in some sort of endgame. So Magnus realizes he has to play for activity. So he goes rook d1, creating a discovery on the queen. Now Nepo goes bishop a8, sidestepping the attack of the knight. And Magnus goes bishop e4. He could have gotten the pawn back on b5, but Nepo would have probably just sidestepped with his queen, and after knight d6, yes, this pawn is weak, but Nepo has gained some time here. He gets to activate his pieces with a move like rook to b4, followed by c5, trading off the bishops, and this will likely be very tough for Magnus. So Magnus once again keeps playing for activity. He goes bishop to e4. Now here, a move like bishop takes a4, b takes e4 looks attractive, right? You take another pawn, you open up the rook, but here Magnus had something very nasty cooked up. He probably wanted to go bishop takes h7, and after king takes, queen h5 check, king g8, and rook to d4, to bring the rook into the attack and go for a checkmate on h7 or h8. And it's not easy for black to defend at all. If black takes a pawn on b2, he will be in trouble. Like rook h4 will be played, black has a check on b1, but white just goes king up. Black has another check on c5, but white once again goes king up, and now there's no more checks. And how are you going to stop queen h7 or queen h8 checkmate? The only thing you can do really is to give up your queen for the knight to free the square for your king, but after takes, black is just completely lost. So after rook d4, Nepo would have to play queen e7, so that after rook h4 he could give up his queen here. But this position is not clear at all. The queen and knight is known to be a very strong attacking combination, because the queen moves like straight and diagonally, and the knight moves in L shapes, right? So they pretty much together they have like all different ways of attacking, if that makes sense. So Nepo could have taken here on b2, and after queen takes c4, it looks like he's losing the pawn on e6, but he still has a check on b1, king g2, another check here with the bishop, and after king h3, he can defend his pawn just in time with bishop to d5. And this may look great for black, because he's hitting the queen, he's ready to push this pawn up the board, he's hitting this pawn here, but white can play queen takes c5 and he solves all his problems at once. He's defending the pawn, he's stopping this pawn, but the position is likely to be balanced. Anyway, Nepo did not go into all of this. Instead, he played c3, which was quite surprising, to be honest. Like, why would you give up a pawn voluntarily? During the broadcast, Hikaru and I were expecting someone like queen e7 to bring the queen a little bit closer to the defense. White can play queen h5, but here you can go g5 to defend the pawn on h7. Like, you can play g6, but here white can sack on g6. Now queen g7 is met by queen takes e6. And once again, black's king is pretty unsafe because white has all these attacking ideas of rook d4 and rook to g4. But g5 should have given Nepo a big advantage. But instead of that, he played c3, and Magnus played queen to c2. Probably Nepo's idea was that if white takes, now he wanted to take here. And he gained some time if Magnus would go for the same variation with bishop takes h7, check, and now rook d4, because now the rook is free to move, so he would have a check, and c5 would come with a check, so the rook is lost. So that was his idea, but in the meantime he's losing a pawn, which is pretty valuable, of course. Magnus goes queen c2 first, hitting the pawn on h7. Nepo goes g6 to block. Magnus takes on c3. And now Jan takes on a4, opening up his rook. Magnus recaptures. But it's not so easy, because you cannot play c5 just yet. That would hang your queen. So Nepo plays rook fd8 first. He wants to go c5, the queen is now protected, and at least trade off these bishops. But Magnus goes rook a1, c5, and queen c4. Now Nepo finally gets a trade, but after Magnus recaptures, we get into this position where, like, white has a rook, queen, and knight, and black has a queen and two rooks. So black is up in exchange, but all of his pawns are pretty weak. Also, the king is feeling a bit airy, so it's very difficult to create any chances at all here with black. Now, first things first, knight f6 is threatened with a big fork, so Nepo goes king h8 to sidestep that. Now he wants to go queen d5 or queen d3 to trade the queens on the next move, so Magnus goes knight at d6 to block in the queen. Nepo goes rook b6, and after queen takes c5, rook b8. He wants to go rook b1 and trade off one pair of rooks, so Magnus goes king to g2. So rook b1 does not come with a check. Now here, Jan could have played queen c6 check, which would have forced a trade of queens. But Magnus would have probably taken, and taken the pawn on a7, and Jan would have probably taken on c3. And things look pretty decent for black, right? He's up in exchange, white is a pawn, but he can't really be risking much here. But it's still a bit unpleasant if white goes knight f7, king g8, and knight g5, hitting both the pawns. And it's likely that some sort of 4 versus 2 endgame where white has a rook and a knight, and black has the two rooks will arise, where black definitely still has to work hard to make the draw. So instead of that, Jan plays a6, keeping his a-pawn. Now he wants to go queen c6. So for that reason, Magnus goes king h3, to make sure that this does not come with a check. So instead, Nepo plays rook c6, hitting the queen. Magnus plays queen to d4. Jan goes king g8, and Magnus goes c4, pushing the c-pawn a little bit up the board. So for that reason, Jan goes queen c7, stopping c5, and Magnus goes queen g4, hitting the pawn on e6. And I think here Jan made a pretty good decision. He could have played queen to e7, but the game had really shifted in Magnus's favor. Like, first he was down in exchange and a pawn, and now he has a pawn for the exchange. So, and like, this knight on d6 is very strong. Right, so Magnus would not be risking much here. So it's likely that here he would have continued with a move like king g2 and then h4, h5 to put pressure on black's king side. So instead of all that, Jan takes a more forcing approach and he gives back the exchange on d6. Magnus recaptures, he takes. So here it is likely that somehow like all of these pawns will be traded and that will end up in a 3 versus 2 endgame, which is still a little bit unpleasant for black, but it has to be a draw. So Magnus goes c5, hitting the queen. Jan could have gone queen c6 here, but once again, like the game continues, Magnus builds up a little bit of pressure. So Jan did not want any of that. He played queen takes c5. Now Magnus gets to take on e6 and on a6. Now note that this pawn is hanging, but black cannot actually take it, because if you take, white's going to give a check and black's in trouble. If you go back to the 8th rank, white can take with a check. And if you go to f7, I force you to go. No wait, actually not that, because of queen here, but I force you back with queen c7. Right, and now I take with check. But, so, what happens if black goes king h6? Right, because if you take now, black has a couple checks, but it doesn't really do much. If black gives a check here, white goes king up. If you give a check here, white blocks with the queen, forcing the trade of queens, and white is winning. And black can take the rook on a6, and this might seem equal, right? It's a queen endgame 2 versus 2, but sadly white is a move, and there's queen f8, checkmate. So instead of all that, Jan played rook to f8, hitting the pawn on f2. So Magnus goes f4, keeping his extra pawn, but now Jan goes queen f5, forcing a queen trade. And so to get into this endgame, Magnus gives a check, forcing the king back to the last rank. So this endgame is still a little bit unpleasant, but Jan knew that this had to be a draw. And at the top Grandmaster level, there's no way Magnus would ever win this. So Magnus goes king g4, Nepo goes rook b5, he's just patiently waiting on the 5th rank, making sure that Magnus cannot progress. So Magnus goes rook e7, rook a5 and rook e5 to make sure that he can step up with the king. Rook a7 was played by Nepo to make sure that he can play king g7 and he will not be hit with a check. Now Magnus goes h4, king g7 and h5. And this is really where Nepo plays the last important defensive move. He plays king to h6. Now you might be wondering, like, why is this move so important? Right, like, can't he just wait with a move like rook b7? But if you go rook b7, white's going to play king g5. And here black has a tough decision to make. Do you allow h6, right, fixing this pawn on h7 as a potential weakness? Or do you go h6 yourself? But now white steps back with the king. And now your pawn is no longer protected with another pawn. So you would have to recapture with the king. And this endgame is pretty unpleasant, because white has the f and g pawns versus the h pawn. So with this pass pawn, white can create more chances easily. So Nepo goes king h6 to stop white from going king g5. Now Magnus goes king h4 to try to push the g pawn up the board, but Nepo anticipates that with the move rook a1, and after g4 he gives a check, king g3. Now he takes. His rook is protecting the pawn. So Magnus gives a check, king g7 and g5. But he has a passed f pawn, but nothing can really happen here. Nepo gives a check, and after king f2 goes rook to a1. Magnus goes rook h6, going after the pawn on h5. But Nepo just goes rook a4, hitting the pawn on f4. Magnus defends it. Jan gives a check. I mean, you can go up with the king, but he will just keep checking you on the 4th rank. So Magnus went back to f2, Jan played rook a4. Both players looked at each other here, they shook hands. So that wraps up game number 2 of the 2021 World Chess Championship match between world champion Magnus Carlsen and challenger Jan Nepomniachtchi. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I definitely plan on making more of these, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.